Next, we're going to look at factors that will influence both the force of muscle contraction and the velocity or the speed of muscle contraction. So first, we're going to look briefly at what may influence the force of muscle contraction. The main thing to remember is that it is all dependent on the number of cross bridges, but there are different ways that you can change the number of cross bridges. You can increase the total number of fibers, the size of the fibers, how frequent you stimulate the muscle cell, or how much the muscle is stretched. So for the muscle cell recruitment, if you increase more muscle fibers, you recruit more muscle fibers, you get more force because if you add it all up, you have even more cross bridges. The more muscle fibers, the more cross bridges that are formed. Increasing the size of the fibers, if you put a lot of metabolic demand on a muscle cell, you can grow that cell a little bit larger. The larger the size of the muscle cell, that means the more protein filaments are inside the muscle cell, the more myofilaments. That means you get even more thin and thick filaments, more cross bridges, more force. Frequency of the stimulation. This is related to that idea of summation and tetany that we've already covered. And then a length tension relationship. You will try and maintain muscle fibers at right around 80 to 120% of the normal resting length. And when they're in that area, you generate more force. We'll look at a graph associated with that. So here's just looking at all of these. So we see in our entire muscle cell, so here's our entire muscle cell. Our entire muscle, if we increase the sheer number of cells that are recruited, you're going to get more force of contraction. If we look at the difference between relatively small diameter muscle fibers compared to much larger diameter muscle fibers, the larger muscle fibers will produce more cross bridges, more force. Here's an example of our wave summation and tetany. So that high frequency of stimulation gives us more force of contraction. And then we're also going to look at the relationship between the sarcomere total length and the amount of force that can be generated. So here's a nice little graph illustrating the relationship between the length of the sarcomere and the force that is generated. So down here on the x-axis, we see percent of resting sarcomere length. A normal sarcomere is going to be at its optimal length, so it should maintain itself somewhere around 100% of its normal length. Here we see the tension that is produced, so 100% would be the maximum amount of tension that could be produced. 0 is if there is no contraction whatsoever. So most of the time your body will try and maintain contraction somewhere between, or the resting length somewhere between 80% of the optimum and 120% of the optimum. And when it's within that area, you can see that the graph is a little bit flattened out, right? So that means you're going to be able to generate a lot of force really quickly. You can see that at that length, there's a good number of cross bridges already formed. The strength is related to the number of cross bridges. If you begin to overly shorten, you can see that you begin to get this overlap here in the thin filaments. Well, that will actually reduce the amount of cross bridges that can be formed. So you'll see this decline in the total amount of tension that can be developed. If you begin to overly stretch the sarcomere, right here you can see that there's even fewer cross bridges. So with an overly stretched sarcomere, you can also see there is a gradual reduction in the amount of tension or force that can be produced. We can also change how fast the muscle cell will contract and how long it can contract. So we're going to look at 3 main ways that you can influence velocity, speed of contraction, and duration of contraction. Looking at different types of muscle fibers, the load that you put on the muscle, and how many muscle cells are recruited. So first let's look at the different types of muscle cells, the different types of muscle fibers. We can classify muscle fibers with two different characteristics. How fast the speed of contraction is. And the main thing that will influence this is the speed of activity of the myosin ATPase. How fast does it split ATP? And the faster it splits ATP, the faster it will go through the contraction cycle, the cross-bridge cycling. So fast myosin ATPases go through ATP very quickly and contraction is faster. Slow myosin ATPases go through the contraction cycle much slower and the total contraction is also much slower. The other major way that cells can vary is by the preferred metabolic pathway. So we've already gone through the types of ATP producing pathways. We've looked at creatine phosphate, anaerobic respiration, and aerobic respiration. So some muscle fibers will be able to really use aerobic cellular respiration, and so we call those oxidative fibers. But some are more specialist in anaerobic respiration, and remember the first step of anaerobic respiration was called glycolysis, so we call those glycolytic fibers. Now, so we have two main ways that they can vary, but that gives us three different types of muscle fibers. We have slow oxidative fibers, fast oxidative fibers, and fast glycolytic fibers. So slow oxidative fibers will have slow myosin ATPase activity, but will use primarily aerobic cellular respiration. Fast oxidative fibers would have fast myosin ATPase activity, but again use mainly aerobic cellular respiration. Fast glycolytic fibers split ATP very quickly and use primarily anaerobic cellular respiration. So most muscles will have a mixture of all of these different fiber types. But not every muscle will have the same dominant one. So some muscles will be dominantly fast glycolytic. Some muscles will be dominantly fast oxidative. Some muscles will be dominantly slow oxidative. Your large postural muscles have to contract for a very long period of time. So those are going to be mostly slow oxidative. Your arm muscles usually are busy just quickly picking things up and putting them back down. Those are going to be mainly fast glycolytic fibers. Your leg muscles need to be able to continue contracting on and off for a very long period of time, but they usually need fairly quick contractions, so leg muscles are going to be dominantly fast oxidative fibers. Now within a single motor unit, all the muscle fibers will be the same type. So you'll have a motor unit made of only slow oxidative, or a motor unit made of only fast glycolytic. And of course there's also some genetics. Some people will just genetically be predetermined to have more slow oxidative fibers. Usually those people are going to more excel at endurance sporting events. Some people will be born with a greater percentage of fast glycolytic fibers. They may be better suited to either sprinters or perhaps bodybuilders. So I'm not going to go through everything in this table, but I want you to make sure that you go through table 9.2 in your textbook, which shows you different structural and functional characteristics of the three major types of fibers. All right. Now, something else I do want to draw your attention to is some physical difference, some structural characteristics. For example, the slow oxidative fibers will usually be a darker red color. Think of dark meat in chicken, the leg and thigh muscles. There's a lot of myoglobin, there's a lot of blood capillaries there because they need a lot of oxygen. They're slow oxidative. Compared to the fast glycolytic fibers, which are usually very pale, not a lot of myoglobin for storing oxygen, not a lot of capillaries for bringing in oxygen, and that's because they mainly rely on anaerobic respiration. But slow oxidative fibers are fairly small diameter. So even though they resist fatigue really well, because they never run out of ATP energy, or it's very hard to get them to run out of ATP energy, they don't produce a lot of power because they are thinner. There's less total cross bridges that can form compared to the fast glycolytic fibers, where you usually have lots of protein build up inside the fiber, very thick diameter, lots of cross bridges, lots of power. So one thing that can influence the speed of contraction and the duration of contraction will be the type of fibers. The other is the influence of load. So this is the weight that you're trying to move. Muscles contract faster when you don't add weight. If you increase the amount of load, then you're increasing the initial tension put on the muscle, the weight that you're trying to move. That's going to begin to stretch the sarcomere a little bit. So to overcome that weight, you're going to have to increase the number of cross bridges. Well, this is going to increase the latent period, the period of time before you see the first change in the length of the muscle. So you get an increase in the latent period, so you get slower contraction, and you'll begin to see a decrease in the duration of contraction with load. So here we can see in the first graph, we see the decrease in the amount of shortening that can occur. A light load usually can move over a very long distance. Heavy loads, you don't shorten the sarcomere quite as much. And in the second graph, you can see that relationship between the velocity of how fast the muscle will shorten with the increasing load. So the speed will decrease with an increased load. And then recruitment. You've heard the phrase, many hands make light work. It's the same sort of idea with muscle cells. The more muscle cells you have active, the faster the contraction occurs and the greater the duration. They can spread the load over many different muscle fibers. Now, you can have some shifts in the types of fibers or how well the fibers can contract for a longer period of time by looking at adaptations of the muscle fibers to exercise types. So aerobic or endurance exercise will usually lead to an increase in the amount of muscle capillaries, the number of mitochondria, and the amount of myoglobin, which stores oxygen. So all of those will increase the ability of the cell to use oxygen. So if you're able to use oxygen more, if you can create more ATP through aerobic cellular respiration, you have greater endurance. You resist fatigue much better. And in fact, you can slowly convert some of the fast glycolytic fibers into fast oxidative fibers if they increase their ability to use aerobic cellular respiration. Now, resistance exercise, think of weightlifting, that's more anaerobic type exercise. The total time of contraction is typically going to be less than 30 seconds. So if you're, I don't know, if you're doing biceps curls, you'll flex the arm, and it usually will take less than 30 seconds to completely flex the arm, and then you'll extend the arm, and it takes less than 30 seconds to do a complete extension. So each of those rounds of contraction will be less than 30 seconds. You're primarily relying on anaerobic cellular respiration. Well, when you're relying on that anaerobic cellular respiration, you're usually also generating a lot of force, so you may see some muscle hypertrophy, increasing the muscle fiber size because of an increased amount of myofilaments. You get an increased amount of mitochondria, more glycogen being stored because anaerobic respiration needs to start with glucose, which is stored as glycogen, and you have to increase the connective tissue components. You're putting more force on the bone, so you need more reinforcement, more endomysium, paramysium, and epimysium. All right, so that does it for the different structures that can affect the duration and the speed of contraction. The next video, we're going to begin to wrap things up by looking at a comparison of the skeletal, cardiac, and smooth muscle. Until now, all of our discussion of muscle cellular anatomy, the physiology of the muscle cell, has mainly been concerning skeletal muscle fibers. Now we're going to look at different types of muscle fibers.